Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. In this episode, I'll be talking to the authors of a book called 2020's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. One of the authors is Tom Sine, a man who has written many books and influenced many lives. And in fact, this podcast has deep ties to his profound influence. You see, Earth Keepers podcast is an expression of an organization called Circlewood. Circlewood itself grew out of an organization called Mustard Seed Associates. And that organization was founded by Tom and his wife, Christine. The other author of this book is Dwight Friesen, a friend and colleague of mine at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. Both Dwight and Tom make the urgent case that people of faith need to become innovative problem solvers in the face of the desperate challenges we face in this present age.
From the plastic in the oceans to the pollution of the skies, a host of challenges that require creative new responses and people of faith getting on board with being a part of that.
In the first half of this episode, then, we'll hear from Tom, and in the second from Dwight. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Tom, it is so good to have you on the podcast today. To orient our listeners, maybe you can tell us what you do day to day. How would you describe your vocation?
I'm a researcher and writer, try to make sense out of some of the changes that we're facing in this very challenging time, and try to help people of faith find creative ways to respond to some of those changes. I think that's the simplest way to put it.
I know that for me, your impact, the impact of your friendship, but also the impact of the books that I've read, has been to give me courage and permission for joy. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I think the message of your life, or at least one of the core messages, is don't accept things the way they are. Have the courage to innovate and design and dream beyond limitations. And I think the second part of your message is have the courage also to figure out what you love to do, what your passions are, how your gifts and callings actually connect to this work of radical change that we can all be part of.
Well, thank you. You remember my stuff better than I do, but that's true.
When you look back over all the various books that you've written, how would you describe the key issues that tend to grab your attention?
Well, the most recent book I've completed with my friend Dwight Friesen is the best example because I think we finally got it right after 10 books. Essentially, there are 3 things we're trying to help people of faith to do. Number 1, to do something that churches rarely do, and that's to learn from business innovators how to anticipate the coming waves of change, not only that will impact the church, but the folks in the church, Generation Next, and our neighbors in this time of turbulent change. So that provides lead time to respond. Number 2 is to learn from business innovators, urban planners, environmental planners, how to research the most innovative ways to respond to that change, because church leaders just tend to do what's familiar and not research the broad range of possibilities, not only for themselves, but for Generation Next, for neighborhood change making, so that we've got the best possibilities. And number 3, for followers of Jesus, to make those selections of innovative response that reflect what it means to be a follower in times like these.
I'm wondering, in terms of the book that you are talking about, the most recent book, how does that actually apply to matters of environmental care?
Oh, well, right at the first chapter of the book, we talk about some of the daunting environmental challenges that we're facing because I think we're dealing with limited time now to begin to respond to the heat experience that we've had on the West Coast in Oregon, Washington, California, and the forest fires that are going to be coming in the very near future. So I think it's been a wake-up call for those that have been in denial about climate change. Then the global situation, from the plastic in the oceans to the pollution of the skies, a host of challenges that require creative new responses and people of faith getting on board with being a part of that.
So we'll talk about those things in just a bit. I want to know more about you, or at least I want the listeners to know more about you. I've known you forever, so I think I know quite a bit. I want to know how you would describe your relationship to nature, and how is that even connected to your spiritual life?
Well, I grew up as a very young man in San Francisco, where I had the run of the city as a 6, 7, and 8-year-old, which you couldn't do in small town anywhere these days, and played in a lot of vacant lots and parks. From a very early age, went camping with the YMCA. My first job was working in the Redwoods as a dishwasher for a Methodist camp. I had a very intimate relationship because I was outdoors all of the time and learned to value the beauty and the wonder of God's creation.
When I think about your relationship to nature, I flash back to this story that I've heard a couple of times of you on a rock by a river. What was that about?
Oh, that was when I was camping, the YMCA camp in Yosemite National Park. If it's the same story you were thinking of, I was just deeply impressed by this huge, rapid stream that was shooting down the mountains. So I climbed up on an enormous boulder so that I could get the full experience. And I almost got more of a full experience than I counted on. All of a sudden, I started slipping down to going into the stream. They never would have found me again.
Hmm.
And at the last possible moment, I flipped over as a 10-year-old on my stomach and grabbed the rock I was on and gradually help myself get out of harm's way.
How would you say that creation care and all matters environment figure into your vocation and calling?
That really began with the first Earth Day. April 22nd, 1970, I was working at Maui Community College in Hawaii. I was dean of students there. I enjoyed the work and a beautiful place to live. And one day I heard that a guy named James Dater was coming, political science professor from the University of Hawaii, to speak to us on something called the First Earth Day. And there were just under 50 of us, primarily students, a few staff. Well, I don't know how else to describe this, but it was my second conversion experience because I prided myself as a young 30-something on keeping up on what we used to call current events. But there was no sense that I had or many others had that the world was changing. And it wasn't just his presentation that turned my world upside down, but I spent the rest of the days at a student protest who gathered a huge number of black bags and walked 3 blocks down from the community college campus to a motel that was right on the ocean. And out there, the students started filling their bags with the garbage that they put out every single day for the ocean to take away. And it was somewhere approximating 50 large bags of garbage, brought them into the motel. And in Hawaiian culture at that time, you do not stand up and confront people in authority. So when the motel owner came out and saw these 50 huge bags, his language was very rich and colorful. He screamed at these young people, and I was one of the few non-young people there, and they didn't cave. They stayed there. And finally, about dinner time, the manager caved and said, okay, I'll have it picked up. And so the students then gathered it up and took it to the local depository. And the combination of all of that became a calling. And that's how I wound up in Seattle 3 months later, starting a doctoral program in intellectual history with a minor in strategic foresight, in forecasting. So I took courses in the social management of technology, which was an environmental program, School of Business, and the School of Urban Planning to try to learn how to communicate to church leaders that don't really study that topic. And so that was the beginning of my story.
So fast forward then to the genesis of Mustard Seed Associates. Just to remind listeners, Mustard Seed Associates is the organization that spawned Circlewood, which is the sponsor of this podcast. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how Mustard Seed Associates came about.
As a result of working in England on my first book that you mentioned, and then continuing to go back there and get to know the people, I was very impressed with many of the things that they were doing environmentally, but I was also very drawn to Celtic spirituality. And so I, over a course of probably 5 or 6 years, visited Iona, which is a small island. And the reason this is important for us gets back to my major field, which is intellectual history. And I want to say this gently because I don't want to cause listeners to be distressed, but part of what's happened in Western society, in all of our churches, mainline Catholic, evangelical, is that I really believe that our worldview has been shaped much more by the Enlightenment and Western assumptions about how the world works and what's important. And driven individualism has gotten in the way of people having time for neighbors, having time for God, having time to be concerned about the environment. And my real concern that the Iona experience in Celtic Christianity made me aware of is that we have adopted in society, and I think for many of us in the church, a very utilitarian view of the natural world. We tend to see it as a place where we dig our oil, set up our campers, stuff we use, largely detached from anything that we do on Sunday. And what Celtic Christianity helped me discover, that of course was pre-Enlightenment, is that early Celtic community really saw the spirituality of creation. So from the time they got up in the morning till they lit their fires, they had their breakfast, everything was to a prayer of thanksgiving for the goodness of God's creation. It wasn't just stuff we used, but it was directly connected in a very spiritual way. And so I think part of what needs to be recovered for Christians involved in environmental change is to move away from a utilitarian stuff we use approach to a spirituality that really sees God's creation in other terms. Let me just read a little bit. Indeed, they bring us back to the motif of the Celtic knot, where everything on earth and in heaven is interconnected, interdependent, and all linked intimately to God. Here indeed is most graphically illustrated John Donne's oft-quoted dictum that no man is an island entire to himself. The same point is also made about the great farce in which perhaps the commonest of all the prayers passed down by the Celts through oral tradition, the invocation of God's blessing on the daily process of kindling the fire when they smored peats, were brought to life again in the morning in finding God's presence in everybody and everything, however high, however lowly. Celtic Christianity also found the most fundamental reason for loving and serving others. And so the need for all Christian environmental projects to recover a sense of the spirituality of God's creation and understand that as an integral part is part of why we started the Celtic project. And when we started that way back in the early 80s, I started looking all over the Northwest for a place to develop a Celtic prayer retreat site. We found 200 acres on Camano Island. We couldn't afford the whole thing. We mortgaged our house, we bought the land, and as you know and have participated, we started developing a Celtic prayer retreat site there, where we got together every August. And we had an overnight with friends of all backgrounds who were interested in both the preservation of the natural world, but also the kind of Celtic worship that was a part of that.
One thing that's true about you and Christine is that you tend to be the center of community, that people are drawn to you, that you draw people to you. Do you think that Celtic Christianity, Celtic thinking has anything to do with community?
Oh, my goodness, yes. It's integral to community. In fact, one of the things that I've discovered, I'm sure you've seen Christine Pohl's books on hospitality. In her second book, she painted a picture that was brand new for me in terms of the very first community. The very first community did not worship God in buildings. The very first community in Israel moved together and became like an intergenerational family of people from different races, different socioeconomic background. They weren't all Jews, and they became a new transnational, transracial family. And that had never been seen before on this planet. So at the core of being followers of Jesus is not showing up at a church building twice a month, which has become the kind of rule these days, but actually choosing to live together and share life together with a real appreciation and intimacy with the created world that somehow got lost.
So I wonder how you feel about the future. You are a futurist and by trade make it your habit to look forward often. When you do that in terms of the environment in particular, do you have hope?
I do have hope, but we're going to need to accelerate. You know, when I got on this train way back with the first Earth Day, there was concern, but there was very limited awareness. We have more awareness now, and thankfully, even corporations are smart enough to realize they're not going to have a clientele if they don't protect the environment too. So many corporations have become friends of the environment, and they're making radical changes to try to make a difference. But it's going to take a much stronger movement. And in America, thank God that our current leadership is trying to make radical improvement in environmental stewardship. But I don't know, frankly, how hopeful I am right now. But I think I'm certainly aware that we don't have very long. God help us. This is a daunting time we're entering, but also a time of possibility.
In our conversation thus far, Tom Sine has been challenging us to be the change that we want to see happen. Indeed, one of the core goals of this podcast is to help people to think creatively about loving and caring for the earth in their everyday lives. To that end, we'll be trying something new in the podcast. Next month, I'll be co-hosting an episode with Courtney Christensen, founder and director of Sparks and Matches. Together, we'll be sharing really practical ideas for greener living and even reviewing products that can help us to reduce our carbon footprint. Now here's the thing. We want to involve you. We're asking anyone, anywhere in the global community to send us your ideas for topics that you think we should address in this episode, or questions that we can answer for you on the show. You can do that in one of two ways. You can send us an email at earthkeepers@circlewood.online, or even better, you can record a voicemail on the podcast website at www.circlewood.online/podcast. We look forward to hearing from you, friends. We're all in this together. Now, please join me for the second part of this episode a conversation with my friend, Dwight Friesen. So, Dwight, welcome to the podcast. I wonder if you could introduce yourself and tell us what you do generally day to day.
Well, Forrest, it's great to be with you, and thank you for all that you do and your team does. In the day-to-day stuff of life, I genuinely am trying to discover a way of love. There's no question about it. Jesus is my guru in that way, and I believe that I'm part of an ecosystem of relations, which daily invites me to discover and practice faithful presence. I live with my partner and my son and my dog and my neighbors and my neighborhood, and I work with the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, where I teach practical theology. Typically, my research focuses on discovering a way of faithful presence as persons and as local faith communities. So church is really my focus in a lot of ways.
Tell us about your book in the most general sense, and what are the impacts that you hope the book will have on people who read it?
Part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, besides the content, was actually to be able to be with Tom Sine, the co-author. And so being with him, a man who had mentored me since the mid-90s, who had been a sort of a loving male figure in my life, have an excuse to be with him. I'm really grateful for that. And that was worth doing it, even if the book had never been published. 2020's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. The title can be a little bit misleading because I think for some people they picked it up thinking that it was going to be sort of walking through the top 10 big issues coming in the 2020s or something like that. It's less about that. This book is really about putting in the hands of everyday people tools that can help them read the signs of the times, sort of anticipate the changes that might come their way. And we actually kind of try to do that. We try to help them imagine how they could engage in what we call probability forecasting. That's not important. But the idea is to just pay attention to what's happening. What are you aware of? You don't have to do a lot of research. I heard there was a Sunday school teacher that I was talking with who used the book with her, I think it was her a 4th grade class. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. She just asked the kids, what do you think might change because of COVID-19? How might things be different for you? And they just brainstormed a whole bunch of things on the whiteboard, and that they were kind of anticipating. You don't have to be a futurist to anticipate. You just have to be aware of the things that might be that you might be worrying about. And then she asks, okay, if some of those things might happen, what do you think God might invite of us? And that's kind of the reflecting piece. They could do some more research, I suppose, those fourth graders, if they wanted to, and that might be helpful. But they began talking about things like what it might look like when you feel lonely or sad, and talk about how you might encourage. They started listing things that they could practically do. We could bring toilet paper to our next door neighbor. Whatever they came up with, I don't know. And then they began to innovate. Well, what could we actually do? What could we do together? How could we encourage each other to act sort of out of hope and out of possibility rather than retreat out of fear and terror or something like that? And that's really the hope of the book, to put into people's hands tools to anticipate, to reflect, and to innovate. We use the word innovate with some intention. It's a complicated word in some ways, but what we're trying to get after there is that there's not a solution here. We have to experiment our way to new realities. And so we use that word for innovation to just say we're breaking from the status quo. We're breaking from how it's been. We're going to try something that's a little bit different. And that's really what we're trying to do, empower people to do. And so all the stories we tell, all the examples we give, all of that, it's not about providing solutions. It's trying to sort of arouse the imagination that anybody, any church, any group, any business, they can do this work. And to be honest, there's a deep spirituality to it. Those 3 movements are more or less Benedictine Lectio Divina, which is another form of deep listening.
So in that book, there is in your collective voice really at times a sense of urgency, a sense of passionate exhortation, as if you are speaking in resistance against something. Could you define that something? What is it that would keep people from deep listening, from futuring, looking forward, even from designing and innovating? What is the pushback on that? Why is that not something that people naturally do?
I think the short answer is just fear. If we take James' proverb that fear and love sort of don't coexist, If you're so worried about what you're going to lose is that you can't move, then you're not going to be able to move with love toward what's unknown. Jesus just keeps blowing me away. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And again, neighbor is an expansive term for all things, but that invitation to love over fear. Fear keeps us stuck where we are, keeps us entrenched. Fear makes us defend what's not even worth defending sometimes. But a way of love, a way of openness, a way of curiosity, a way of wonder, a way that says, even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane says, not my will, but thine be done. Like, in some ways, that's love over fear. Love over fear. And it's like, that's always the dare, right? Not my will, but thine. I want to be safe. I want to be happy. I want to be wealthy. I want to be well-liked. I want to fill in all those things, right? And I can fight for those things. I can defend those things. Love is going to invite me to open up to that which I don't necessarily know. And it's the way of Jesus.
Well, it's the way of trust also, isn't it? Because it means that we give up control. We give up the illusion of predictability. We open up our small, carefully defined universe to actually what's reality around us, or the vastness of reality. And that, I think, is cause enough for fear. The reality that surrounds us, I think we protect against that by creating our own little internalized framework for life that keeps us small, keeps us from listening, keeps us even from relationship in a lot of ways.
That is so true. I don't know when it was that I realized that all of our worldviews are made up. It's super important, though. It's not that they're not important and vital and so on, but even my understanding of who I am is a fiction that I carry inside myself. I am not those thoughts. I am not the narrative I tell of myself, and the world is not the narrative I hold either. If I can actually open up to it and welcome it, let it teach me. Again, as long as I cling to what I think is the whole of reality, I can't be open-handed because my fists are busy clinging. There's something about opening up to welcome. I guess I do kind of feel as though there's this irreducible invitation from the divine to humanity to become more carnal, in the sense that to really pay attention to the flesh, to the reality that I am a bodied creature. And my body is somewhere, and my body is now. To wonder, in what way is the nowness of my body in this place inviting me to discover and to act faithfully? I think that's at the core of what it means to be human, to find that kind of dynamic. It's not an answer, it's a way of being, I think.
You use that phrase, deep listening, and I'm curious if you could explain or suggest what that could mean when it comes to creation care, when it comes to listening to place, listening to environment. What does that process look like? And then when you talk about futuring, what is the next step then that comes out of that place of deep listening?
So on a very tactical and practical level, I think deep listening could simply begin by walking your neighborhood. To walk our neighborhood slowly, not just to have our dog do its business or whatever, but to actually prayerfully open ourselves up to invite the Spirit to teach us through our place. Place is a guru. It is guiding us. It's whispering to us to discover and to notice. Notice what's different. Notice what's changing. Notice what you feel in your body as you walk in your place. What is it inviting of you? I think deep listening, when you try to listen to a friend or a partner, or you don't always know what you're listening for. You're simply opening your heart toward the one you love. You have to, there's a stance, there's a posture of openness and love and willingness to receive whatever comes at us. And then the invitation, part of listening, if you just listen and you don't act, you haven't listened. You may have heard something, but there's a kind of way of listening where you take it into your being. And let's say you hear a friend express something of deep sadness. If you just hear that and then walk away, It touches us. It changes us. We then join our friend. We try to offer comfort or at least presence. We move toward. And I think that's the challenge, to listen to creation. You're not going to be able to fix everything. That's not the point. Fixing isn't even necessarily the goal. Joining, acting out of love toward, I think, is the goal. And that only comes by really paying attention. And what's interesting to me, and I think what's really beautiful and hopeful, I think often we get overwhelmed by the vastness of the changes and so on. But just like in any relationship, we listen as particular beings. And so you can't do everything. But there's something particular in you that connects with your own story, your own values, your own personality, whatever it might be, that actually brings you life and is actually within your wheelhouse to be able to do. And so listening, not for what's being advertised on TV or for the social justice issue of the day, but listening for what is being invited of you in this moment.
We've been in conversation with Tom Sine and Dwight Friesen, authors of the book 2020's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. If you would like to know more about Tom and Dwight's work, please go to the show notes for this episode at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Olfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jessalyn Megerly is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us next time on the Earthkeepers podcast.